August 8, 1945. In Tokyo, Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori had spent months crafting Japan's last diplomatic hope, convinced the Soviet Union to mediate a negotiated peace with the Americans. The Neutrality Pact, signed 4 years earlier, still had 8 months to run. Stalin had rebuffed Japanese overtures, but he hadn't said no definitively. There was still time. There had to be time. At 11 o'clock that night, Soviet Ambassador Yakov Malik requested an emergency meeting with Togo. The foreign minister dressed quickly, his hands steady despite the late hour. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps Moscow had finally agreed to help. Perhaps there was a path between the impossible choice Japan faced: unconditional surrender or national suicide. Malik's face told him everything before the ambassador spoke a word. The Soviet Union was declaring war on Japan. The Red Army would begin operations within hours. The Neutrality Pact, Stalin explained through Malik's translated words, had been rendered meaningless by Japan's alliance with Germany. Germany, which no longer existed. The war would begin at midnight Moscow time. In Manchuria, where over 1 million Japanese soldiers and civilians lived, it was already tomorrow. Togo stood silent for a moment after Malik finished. Then he asked the ambassador to repeat the message. Malik did. The foreign minister's carefully constructed diplomatic strategy, months of delicate overtures and coded messages, collapsed in the space of that repeated sentence. The one neutral major power that might have negotiated between Japan and the Allies had just become another enemy. Japan now faced the Americans, the British, the Chinese, and the Soviets, essentially the entire world, with an exhausted military, a starving population, and cities turned to ash. Togo left the meeting and went directly to Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro's residence. It was after midnight now. August 9th. Suzuki, 77 years old, listened to Togo's report with the stillness of a man who had survived an assassination attempt and knew what catastrophe looked like. The Soviet entry changed everything, he said quietly. Everything. The military had promised they could hold Manchuria, could make the Americans pay such a price for invading the home islands that Washington would negotiate. But the Soviets? The Red Army pouring across the Manchurian border? There was no plan for that. There had never been a plan for that. By dawn, reports began arriving from Manchuria. The scale of the Soviet offensive defied comprehension. Not a probe, not a limited attack. 3 entire fronts, over 1.5 million men, thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, crashing across the border simultaneously. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, had been stripped of its best divisions to defend the home islands and the Pacific. What remained in Manchuria were understrength units, obsolete equipment, and new conscripts who had never seen combat. At the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito received the news in silence. For months, he had been maneuvering carefully, trying to guide his government toward peace without overstepping the boundaries of his constitutional role. The emperor did not make policy. The emperor sanctioned decisions made by his government. But Hirohito knew what the military leaders refused to admit. Japan had lost the war. The question was whether Japan would exist at all when the war ended. The Soviet declaration answered that question in the worst possible way. If the Red Army reached the home islands, if Japan was divided like Germany, if the imperial system was destroyed by communist revolution, these were the nightmares that had haunted him since Germany's collapse. Now they were becoming real. Chief Cabinet Secretary Sakomitsu Hisatsune would later describe the mood in the government that morning as something beyond shock. It was, he said, as if the last thread holding us above the abyss had been cut. The Americans had destroyed Hiroshima 3 days earlier with a single bomb, a weapon so powerful it seemed to belong to science fiction rather than war. The military had no answer for it. Now the Soviets were coming, and the military had no answer for that either. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, the Big Six who made all final decisions, met in emergency session. Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, War Minister Anami Korechika, Navy Minister Yonai Mitsumasa, Chief of Army General Staff Umezu Yoshijiro, Chief of Navy General Staff Toyoda Soimu. 6 men who held Japan's fate in their hands, meeting in a room while the world they had known disintegrated. Togo spoke first. The Soviet entry made continued resistance impossible. Japan must accept the Potsdam Declaration, the surrender terms issued by the Allies in July, immediately. The only condition they could insist on was preservation of the imperial system. The emperor must remain. Without that guarantee, surrender was meaningless because the Japanese people would never accept it. But everything else, occupation, disarmament, war crimes trials, territorial losses, must be accepted. There was no choice left. War Minister Anami listened to Togo's argument with his jaw set. Anami was 58 years old, a career army officer who had fought in Manchuria, who had commanded divisions, who believed in the code of Bushido that said death was preferable to surrender. But Anami was also a realist. He knew the military situation. He knew the Americans were preparing to invade. He knew the Soviet entry was catastrophic. What he could not accept was the idea that Japan would surrender unconditionally, that the military would be disbanded, that the officers who had led Japan into this war would be tried as criminals by the victors. Anami proposed 4 conditions for surrender. First, preservation of the imperial system. Second, Japan would disarm its own forces. No foreign occupation troops on Japanese soil. Third, Japan would conduct its own war crimes trials. No victor's justice. Fourth, no occupation of the home islands. These were the minimum terms the military could accept. Anything less would mean the destruction of everything Japan had fought for, everything the 2 million dead soldiers had died for. Navy Minister Yonai, 65 years old, one of the few senior officers who had opposed the war from the beginning, shook his head. The 4 conditions were fantasy. The Americans would never accept them. The Soviets certainly wouldn't. Japan's bargaining position was non-existent. The choice was simple. Surrender with one condition and hope the Allies preserved the emperor, or fight on until Japan ceased to exist as a nation. Chief of Army General Staff Umezu supported Anami. The army could still fight. The home islands had millions of soldiers, thousands of aircraft ready for suicide attacks, a civilian population prepared to resist with bamboo spears if necessary. The Americans had not invaded yet. Make them pay such a price that they would negotiate. The Soviet entry was a setback, yes, but the Red Army would need time to cross Manchuria, time to prepare an invasion of Japan itself. There was still time to make the Americans see reason. Chief of Navy General Staff Toyoda agreed with Umezu. The Navy had been destroyed, yes, but what remained could still be used in suicide attacks. The Americans feared casualties. Make them fear the cost of invasion enough, and they would negotiate. Togo felt the familiar frustration rising. The military leaders lived in a fantasy world where Japan still had leverage, where the Americans could be bargained with, where the Soviet Union was a distant threat rather than an immediate catastrophe. The foreign minister had seen the intelligence reports. The Red Army was not slowly crossing Manchuria. It was racing across it. Soviet tanks were covering 50 miles a day. Japanese defenses were collapsing everywhere. Within days, maybe a week, the Kwantung Army would cease to exist. And then the Soviets would be poised to invade Hokkaido, the northernmost home island. Then Japan would face invasion from 2 directions, and the Americans would have no reason to negotiate at all because the Soviets would do their work for them. Prime Minister Suzuki tried to find middle ground. Perhaps they could approach the Allies informally, test whether the one condition would be acceptable before making a formal surrender offer. Togo said no. Delays were fatal now. Every day they waited, more Japanese died, more cities burned, more of Manchuria fell. The Americans had dropped a second atomic bomb that morning. Nagasaki, destroyed in an instant, just like Hiroshima. How many more of those weapons did they have? How many more Japanese cities would vanish while the Supreme Council debated conditions that the Allies would never accept? The meeting ended in deadlock. 3 votes for accepting Potsdam with 1 condition. Suzuki, Togo, Yonai. 3 votes for demanding 4 conditions. Anami, Umezu, Toyoda. In the Japanese system, the Supreme Council required unanimity. Without unanimous agreement, no decision could be made. Without a decision, the war continued. They met again that night. By then, the reports from Manchuria were worse. Soviet forces had penetrated deep into Japanese-held territory. Entire divisions of the Kwantung Army had been encircled. Communications were breaking down. The speed and violence of the Soviet offensive shocked even the most pessimistic Japanese estimates. This was not the methodical, grinding advance the Japanese had expected. This was blitzkrieg Soviet style, massive armored columns supported by overwhelming air power, smashing through defenses that had been designed to fight the Chinese, not the Red Army. Anami read the reports with a face like stone. The war minister had built his career in Manchuria. He knew the officers commanding those doomed divisions. He knew what the loss of Manchuria meant, not just militarily, but psychologically. Manchuria had been Japan's first major conquest, the foundation of the empire, the source of resources and pride. If Manchuria fell in days rather than months, what did that say about Japan's ability to defend the home islands? But Anami's voice did not waver when he spoke. The army would fight. The home islands were not Manchuria. Every beach was fortified. Every city was a fortress. Every civilian was ready to die for the emperor. The Americans would face resistance that would make Okinawa look easy. Yes, the Soviet entry was a blow. Yes, the atomic bombs were terrible. But surrender on the Allies' terms was unthinkable. The military must have its honor. The officers must not be treated as war criminals. Japan must be allowed to die with dignity, if it must die. Togo wanted to scream. Dignity. Honor. What dignity was there in watching Japanese cities erased by atomic fire? What honor in letting the Soviet Union conquer Manchuria and Korea and prepare to invade the home islands? The foreign minister forced himself to speak calmly. The military's concept of honor would result in the extinction of the Japanese people. That was not honor. That was suicide. And it was not just military suicide. It was national suicide. The Americans might preserve the emperor if Japan surrendered now. The Soviets would not. The Red Army reached Tokyo. The imperial system would be destroyed. The emperor would be tried as a war criminal or executed, and Japan would become a communist puppet state. Was that the honor Anami wanted? Anami's face tightened, but he said nothing. The war minister knew Togo was right about the Soviet threat to the imperial system. That was precisely why the military needed to fight, to prevent the Soviets from gaining a foothold in Japan, to make the Americans see that they needed to negotiate before the Red Army arrived. Navy Minister Yonai spoke quietly. The Americans had already issued their terms at Potsdam. Those terms did not explicitly guarantee the emperor's position, but they did not explicitly abolish it either. The language was deliberately ambiguous. The authority of the emperor shall be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. Subject to, not replaced by. There was room for interpretation. There was room for hope, but only if Japan surrendered now, before the situation became even worse. Toyoda disagreed. The ambiguity was precisely the problem. Subject to could mean anything. It could mean the emperor would be a puppet. It could mean he would be tried and executed. Japan could not surrender without a clear guarantee. The military would never accept it. The people would never accept it. Suzuki looked around the table at the 5 other men. The Prime Minister had been appointed precisely because he was acceptable to both the military and the civilian government. because he could navigate between the factions, because he was old enough and respected enough that both sides would listen to him. But now, he saw that no amount of respect or navigation would break this deadlock. 3 men were willing to accept reality. 3 men were willing to die rather than face it. And without unanimity, the war would continue until there was nothing left to fight for. There was only one man who could break the deadlock. Only one man whose word was absolute, whose decision could override the military, whose authority was literally divine in the eyes of the Japanese people. But asking the emperor to make a policy decision was unprecedented. The emperor sanctioned decisions. He did not make them. For Hirohito to intervene directly would shatter the constitutional framework that had existed since the Meiji Restoration. It would make the emperor personally responsible for the surrender. It would make him vulnerable to the charge that he had betrayed Japan, that he had surrendered when the military was still willing to fight. Suzuki knew it had to be done anyway. Shortly after midnight on August 10th, the Prime Minister went to the Imperial Palace and requested an Imperial Conference, a meeting where the Emperor would be present and could, if he chose, express his will. Hirohito agreed immediately. He had been waiting for this moment, dreading it and knowing it was inevitable. The conference began at 2 in the morning in the underground bomb shelter beneath the palace. The room was hot, humid, uncomfortable. The 6 members of the Supreme Council were there. The president of the Privy Council was there. The emperor sat on a simple chair, silent while the arguments began again. Togo made his case. Accept Potsdam with one condition: preserve the imperial system, end the war before Japan was completely destroyed. The Soviet entry had eliminated any possibility of negotiated peace. The atomic bombs had eliminated any hope of making invasion too costly. The only choice was surrender now or extinction later. Anami made his case. 4 conditions: preservation of the imperial system, self-disarmament, no occupation, Japanese war crimes trials. The military could still fight. The people were ready to die for the emperor. Surrender on the Allies' terms would dishonor every soldier who had died, would make their sacrifice meaningless. Umezu supported Anami. The army had millions of men under arms. The defenses of the home islands were formidable. Yes, the situation was grave, but it was not hopeless. The Americans could still be made to negotiate. Yonai countered. The situation was hopeless. The military's plans assumed the Americans would invade in the fall, giving Japan time to prepare. But the Soviet entry changed everything. The Red Army could invade Hokkaido within weeks. Japan would face invasion from 2 directions. The military could not defend against both. Continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of Japan. Back and forth. The same arguments, the same deadlock. 3 for one condition, 3 for 4 conditions. The minutes passed. The air in the shelter grew thicker. And then Prime Minister Suzuki did something extraordinary. He turned to the emperor and asked him to make the decision. The room fell silent. Every man there understood what Suzuki had just done. He had broken the fundamental rule of Japanese governance. The emperor did not make policy decisions. The emperor was above politics, above factions, a symbol of unity who sanctioned the decisions of his government but did not make them himself. By asking Hirohito to decide, Suzuki was forcing the emperor to take personal responsibility for surrender, to make himself the target of anyone who opposed it. Hirohito stood. His voice was quiet, but every man in the room heard him clearly. He had listened to both sides, he said. He understood the military's position. He honored their loyalty and their courage. But he agreed with Foreign Minister Togo. The war must end. Japan must accept the Potsdam Declaration with the one condition that the imperial system be preserved. Continuing the war would result in the destruction of the Japanese people and the end of the nation itself. That was unacceptable. The decision was made. Anami's face showed nothing, but his hands trembled slightly as he bowed to the emperor. The war minister had argued for continued resistance, but he would not defy the emperor's direct command. None of them would. Hirohito had spoken. The decision was final, but the reality of implementing that decision proved almost as difficult as making it. The surrender message had to be drafted, transmitted to the Allies, explained to the Japanese people. And within the military, there were officers who would see the emperor's decision not as divine will, but as betrayal, who would attempt to prevent the surrender by any means necessary. Over the next 3 days, Anami walked a razor's edge. The war minister had to keep the army from attempting a coup while simultaneously preparing them for the unthinkable: surrender. He met with division commanders, with staff officers, with the young fanatics who wanted to fight to the last man. He told them the emperor had decided. He told them their duty was to obey. Some accepted this, some did not. On the night of August 14th, a group of army officers attempted to seize the imperial palace to find and destroy the recording of the emperor's surrender speech before it could be broadcast. The coup attempt was chaotic, desperate, doomed from the start. The conspirators could not find the recording. They could not convince senior commanders to join them. By dawn on August 15th, the coup had collapsed. Anami spent that night at the war ministry. He had known the coup was being planned. He had done nothing to stop it, but he had also refused to join it. The war minister existed in a space between loyalty to the emperor and loyalty to the military, between acceptance of defeat and refusal to surrender. He could not reconcile these contradictions. He could only endure them for as long as necessary. At dawn, Anami returned to his residence. He dressed in his uniform. He wrote letters to the emperor, to his family, to the army. Then he committed seppuku, ritual suicide, cutting his abdomen in the traditional manner. He died slowly, refusing assistance, accepting the pain as the price of his failure to prevent the surrender and his refusal to support a coup against the emperor. His final written words were an apology. "I apologize to the emperor for my great crime." At noon on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's recorded voice was broadcast across Japan. It was the first time most Japanese people had ever heard their emperor speak. His language was formal, archaic, difficult for ordinary people to understand, but the meaning was clear enough. The war was over. Japan had accepted the Potsdam Declaration. The unendurable must be endured. Togo heard the broadcast in his office. The foreign minister, who had spent months trying to find a diplomatic solution, who had been proven catastrophically right about the Soviet threat, who had argued for surrender when the military still wanted to fight, felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Japan had survived. The imperial system had survived, but at what cost? The cities in ruins, the empire lost, millions dead, and the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Could it have been ended sooner? Could he have done more to prevent the Soviet entry, to convince the military earlier, to save even a fraction of the lives lost in those final months? In Manchuria, the Red Army continued its advance. Soviet forces would occupy Manchuria completely, would seize the Kuril Islands, would establish a presence in Korea that would shape Asian politics for decades. The Soviet entry that Togo had feared, that had finally broken the military's will to continue, had come too late to prevent Japan's surrender, but early enough to give Stalin a seat at the table when Japan's fate was decided. The Supreme Council never met again. The institution that had deadlocked over surrender, that had required the emperor's unprecedented intervention to break the impasse, was dissolved. In its place came the American occupation, General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters, a new constitution that explicitly stripped the emperor of political power and made him what he had always been in theory, but never quite in practice: a symbol of the state, not its ruler. Years later, historians would debate which event truly forced Japan's surrender. Was it Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Soviet declaration of war? The answer, most would conclude, was all of them together. The atomic bombs demonstrated that the Americans could destroy Japanese cities without invasion, without risk, without limit. The Soviet entry destroyed Japan's last hope for negotiated peace and raised the specter of communist revolution. Together, they created a situation where even the most fanatical military leaders could see that continued resistance meant not heroic death, but meaningless extinction. But in that conference room at 2 in the morning on August 10th, when the Emperor stood and made his decision, the men present were not thinking about historical debates. They were thinking about the immediate reality. The Soviet tanks racing across Manchuria, the atomic fires still burning in 2 cities, the American invasion fleet preparing to sail, the Japanese people who would die by the millions if the war continued. They were thinking about the choice between surrender and annihilation, between accepting defeat and embracing apocalypse. Togo's argument had been simple. Japan could survive surrender, but it could not survive continued war. The Soviet entry had proven him right in the most brutal way possible. The military's hope that they could make invasion too costly, that they could negotiate from a position of strength, that they could preserve Japan's honor through continued resistance, all of that died when the Red Army crossed the Manchurian border. Not because the Soviet forces would necessarily reach Japan, but because their entry eliminated any possibility that Japan could end the war on its own terms. The Japanese leaders' words in those final days revealed men trapped between impossible choices. An army's insistence on the 4 conditions was not delusion, but desperation, a last attempt to preserve something, anything, of the military's honor and autonomy. Togo's demand for immediate surrender was not defeatism, but clear-eyed recognition that delay meant death. Hirohito's decision to intervene was not weakness, but the ultimate acceptance of responsibility, knowing that by making the decision himself, he made himself the target of those who would call surrender betrayal. What they said mattered less than what they did. They ended the war. They accepted terms that a month earlier would have been unthinkable. They chose survival over honor, existence over extinction. The Soviet declaration of war, arriving at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible way, destroying the last hope for negotiated peace, forced them to make that choice. And in making it, they saved Japan from the fate that awaited it if the war had continued. Complete destruction, Soviet occupation of the North, American occupation of the South, the imperial system abolished, the nation divided like Germany or Korea. In the end, what Japanese leaders said when the Soviet Union declared war was less important than what they heard in that declaration. The sound of Japan's last option disappearing, the sound of the door closing on any path except surrender, the sound of the future arriving whether they were ready for it or not. They heard it, they understood it, and after 3 days of argument and deadlock and imperial intervention, they accepted it. That acceptance saved Japan. But it came at the price of everything they had fought for, everything they had believed in, everything that had defined Japan's place in the world for the previous 15 years. The war was over. Japan had survived, but the Japan that emerged from the surrender was not the Japan that had gone to war. It was something new, something uncertain, something that would have to be rebuilt from the ruins. And that rebuilding would begin under the shadow of the mushroom clouds, under the weight of Soviet occupation in the north, under the authority of American forces in the south, under the memory of what had been said and done in those final desperate days when the Soviet declaration of war forced Japan's leaders to choose between the unthinkable and the impossible. And they chose the unthinkable because the impossible would have meant there was no Japan left to choose anything at all.